You and I have both seen headlines that sound like plot summaries, not policy. United States issues new warning to Canada. Canada hits back in ways no one expected. It is tempting to treat that as just one more episode in the endless drama of modern politics, a kind of streaming series where you check in, feel a spike of anxiety, and move on. But I want you to pause for a moment and ask a different question. If this is more than a tiff between neighbors, if it is actually a stress test of the economic architecture that holds North America together, what exactly is being tested and what did we just learn? My aim in this conversation is not to tell you who to cheer for, but to pull back the curtain on how power works when economies are deeply intertwined and why this particular confrontation tells us something about the condition of American influence, Canadian strategy, and the health of the larger system we all live inside. On the surface, the official story is simple enough. The United States Trade Representative floated the idea that Washington might be willing to let the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement wither when its renewal comes up, or at least to reopen it in a way that would amount to renegotiation by threat. Around the same time, political figures in Washington indulged loose talk about Canada needing to behave less like a sovereign partner and more like an annex, a 51st state in all but name. None of this was delivered as a formal declaration of economic war. It was framed as tough-minded realism, as a necessary correction of what some describe as an imbalanced relationship. But if you have lived under any trade agreement, whether you farm, run a small business, or simply rely on a job that depends on cross-border supply chains, you know that talk of walking away is not just rhetoric. It is a way of shaking the table that everything else is sitting on. To understand why this matters, you and I need a clear picture of what the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement actually is, stripped of acronyms and diplomatic ceremony. It is not a friendly memorandum between leaders. It is the governing framework for how goods, services, and investment move between three economies that share borders, energy grids, industrial ecosystems, and millions of family ties. Everything from auto parts to grain shipments to data services travels along paths shaped by this agreement. Factories decide where to build based on its rules. Workers pay mortgages based on assumptions about its stability. Communities count on it when they plan schools, roads, and ports. Threaten to walk away from that even in a half-serious tone, and you are not only pressuring a foreign capital, you are injecting uncertainty into the lives of millions of people who have never read a trade chapter in their lives but live inside its consequences every day. In Washington, the expectation seems straightforward. The United States is the largest economy in the arrangement. Canada is smaller and far more dependent on access to the American market. Therefore, so the logic went, a strong warning would cause Ottawa to flinch. The fear of losing privileged access would force Canada to accept revisions more favorable to Washington, whether on energy, agriculture, digital services, or rules of origin in manufacturing. This is the classic assumption of the dominant power in any asymmetrical relationship. Size equals leverage. Leverage equals obedience. The story is as old as empires. Yet history and basic economics both caution that interdependence does not work like a simple lever. Pull hard on one end, and you may find that the pressure travels back up the system in ways you did not anticipate. What makes this episode interesting and frankly important for you as a citizen and as an economic participant is that Canada did not respond as the script predicted. There was no theatrical collapse into panic, no public begging for reassurance, no acceptance of a subordinate role dressed up as partnership. Instead, Canadian policymakers and businesses began to behave as if a warning had finally been heard that had been whispered for years. They asked themselves what any smaller economy eventually must ask when the larger partner begins to treat stability as a bargaining chip. What if the neighbor is no longer dependable? What if the arrangement that anchors our prosperity can be tossed onto the bargaining table every election cycle? That question, once it takes root, changes how an entire country thinks about risk. From that moment, the story stops being about one set of statements from Washington and becomes a story about adaptation. Canada started to accelerate trends that had already begun quietly, diversifying export markets, rerouting energy flows, so that pipelines and shipping lanes did not all point south. Looking to Europe, to Asia, to emerging markets, not as side projects, but as necessary pillars of national resilience. You may have noticed, if you follow energy news at all, that certain Canadian regions long oriented towards supplying the United States now see a majority of their exports landing elsewhere. That did not happen by accident, and it did not happen overnight. It is the product of years of officials and executives asking the same hard question you might ask about your own finances. If one client or one employer holds too much power over you, at what point does prudence require you to reduce that dependence? It teaches the other side how to live with less of it. Once Canadian firms discovered that they could reorganize supply chains to rely less heavily on the United States, once foreign investors discovered that they could place capital in Canada and still reach global markets without threading every decision through American political turbulence, the balance of leverage began to shift. Capital, as any investor will tell you, is a coward. It flees chaos and runs toward predictability. When Washington chose to signal that even a foundational agreement like the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement could be subject to dramatic reconsideration, it told the world something about itself that no press release could spin away. It suggested that the American policy environment had grown less predictable than many had assumed, and that is a revelation with consequences far beyond one quarrel with a northern neighbor. What startled many observers was not simply that Canada absorbed the pressure, but that it transformed that pressure into momentum. The standard narrative in Washington assumed that the United States could rattle the foundations of the trading relationship without ever disturbing its own footing. Yet the moment those threats were issued, capital markets, manufacturers, and foreign investors began reassessing not Canada's stability, but America's. Unlike politicians, investors do not wait for policy to be finalized or clarified. They respond to signals. And the signal Washington sent was unmistakable. The North American trade environment was no longer guaranteed to remain stable. That single perception, once introduced, began to change the behavior of actors across the entire global economy. Canada, instead of shrinking inward, opened outward. It accelerated outreach to Europe, Asia, South America, and emerging markets, not as diplomatic exercises, but as practical preparations for a future where the United States could not be counted on as the sole anchor. This diversification was not driven by ideology. It was driven by a sober assessment of risk. Canadian policymakers recognized that the structure of their prosperity could not rest on the shifting moods of a much larger neighbor, especially one increasingly willing to use unpredictability as a negotiating tactic. And as they moved to build alternatives, they discovered something that often goes unnoticed in global trade. Credibility is a form of power. The more predictable Canada became, the more attractive it looked to global markets. Foreign direct investment responded almost immediately. Capital that might once have flowed automatically into the United States began flowing into Canada instead. Not because Canada had suddenly lowered taxes or radically altered its business climate, but because predictability itself had become a premium asset. Investors seeking a foothold in North America found that they could operate from Canadian soil and still access global markets without exposing themselves to the political volatility radiating from Washington. Canada unintentionally at first began to emerge as a stabilizing alternative inside a region experiencing rising uncertainty. Inside the United States, however, the effects were the opposite of what policymakers intended. When you threaten the foundation of continental trade, you do not create discipline, you create doubt. Manufacturers operating under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement protections suddenly had to factor in the possibility of tariffs or disrupted supply chains. Companies that spent billions designing integrated production systems could no longer assume those systems would survive the next election cycle. And uncertainty is among the most expensive conditions in capitalism. It forces businesses to pause hiring, delay expansion, and rethink long-term commitments. That hesitation turns into slower growth, weaker job creation, and declining economic confidence, all of which became visible across the American economy. By contrast, Canadian firms saw opportunity in the chaos. They began nearshoring, bringing production home, not out of patriotism, but out of necessity. Relying on United States components or United States mediated supply chains had become a financial risk. If the United States was willing to tear up the rules, then the only logical move was to build systems that no longer depended on those rules. Manufacturers started strengthening domestic suppliers, investing in homegrown capacity, and shortening supply lines. And as Canada reduced its reliance on United States intermediaries, the very leverage Washington thought it possessed began to erode. What caught Washington off guard was the feedback loop. As Canadian dependency declined, American dependency became more visible. Industries inside the United States, especially transportation equipment, advanced manufacturing, and energy processing, relied far more deeply on stable Canadian inputs than many politicians realized. When threats were issued, those industries experienced the tremors first. Planning became harder, costs grew unpredictable, and companies began exploring alternative production hubs abroad. The chain reaction did not weaken Canada. It weakened the United States from within. This is the irony that defines the entire episode. A strategy intended to reassert dominance exposed vulnerability instead. A policy designed to pressure a partner ended up pressuring domestic industries. A threat meant to project strength became evidence of instability. Because in a deeply interconnected economy, power is never just about size. It is about reliability, cohesion, and the confidence others place in your commitments. As soon as that confidence is shaken, even slightly, the system reorganizes itself. Canada reorganized quickly. The United States hesitated. And in that hesitation, the balance of influence began to shift in ways few in Washington had anticipated, but many around the world immediately understood. As this transformation accelerated, something became increasingly undeniable. The very tool Washington tried to use as leverage. Uncertainty became a liability that fell hardest on its own economy. Once doubt entered the system, American manufacturers who had built their operations on the assumption of stable cross-border trade began to feel the cracks beneath their feet. Supply chains that had taken decades to refine no longer felt secure. Companies that once treated North America as a seamlessly integrated production zone were now forced to imagine scenarios where borders hardened, tariffs returned, or rules of origin shifted overnight. Every factory manager knows what uncertainty means. It means deferred investment, frozen hiring, and production schedules held hostage by political volatility. For 9 consecutive months, indicators showed United States manufacturing contraction, a stark signal that the tremors Washington created were reverberating through its own industrial base. Consumers felt the instability as well. Trade tensions do not just appear on spreadsheets. They show up in grocery aisles, in shipping delays, in shrinking discounts during major retail events. When even Cyber Monday, often a reliable barometer of consumer confidence, barely registered growth, it reflected more than caution. It reflected households stretched thin by inflation, disrupted supply chains, and price volatility tied to tariff uncertainty. For all the talk of strategic toughness, the real burden fell on workers and families who had no say in geopolitical calculations but absorbed the fallout each time the rules changed. Meanwhile, Canadian policymakers took the American threats as confirmation of a long brewing reality. Dependence on a single partner is no longer sustainable in an era defined by rapid geopolitical shifts. Their response was not emotional, it was structural. Canada began envisioning a dual-track economy, one supply chain oriented toward the United States and another designed for the broader global market. This was not merely a defensive posture, it was the blueprint for a country positioning itself to thrive, regardless of the turbulence beyond its borders. Canadian industries pushed for nearshoring domestic production and reinvestment in local suppliers because the alternative, remaining exposed to United States unpredictability, was no longer acceptable. What made this shift even more striking was how global investors interpreted it. Canada was no longer seen as a mere extension of the American economy, but as a stabilizing force within North America. Its political institutions, though imperfect, did not swing dramatically with each election. Its regulatory frameworks were predictable. Its trade architecture was expansive, connecting it to over 50 free trade partners without the same exposure to political whiplash that increasingly characterized United States policy. In a world hungry for stability, Canada had inadvertently become a premium destination. At the same time, American industries continued to confront the consequences of Washington's strategy. Transport equipment manufacturers, deeply reliant on predictable access to Canadian and Mexican components, began shifting operations abroad. Retail corporations challenged tariff decisions in court, seeking refunds that totaled billions, a sign that the private sector no longer viewed policy swings as temporary noise, but as genuine profit-distorting disruptions. When corporations sue their own government over trade policy, it is a clear indication that the cost of political brinkmanship has spilled into the real economy. This created a widening perception gap. Outside the United States, companies increasingly saw Canada not as a secondary option, but as an alternative hub, especially for sectors like electric vehicles, critical minerals, clean technology, aerospace, and advanced manufacturing. The question circulating among global investors was no longer how do we enter North America through the United States, but rather how do we operate near the United States market without being vulnerable to United States instability? The answer more and more often was Canada. And for the United States, that shift represented more than a policy misstep. It signaled a deeper structural problem. Power derived from dominance can evaporate when that dominance becomes unpredictable. Threats that once pressured smaller partners now risk accelerating those partners' independence. That pattern is not unique to this moment. It is a recurring feature of global capitalism. When one actor weaponizes interdependence, the system reorganizes itself to bypass the source of volatility. Leverage becomes fragility. Pressure becomes incentive. Attempts to enforce hierarchy end up encouraging autonomy. By the end of this phase, two truths had become clear. First, Canada was no longer a passive participant in North American trade. It had become an adaptive, resilient actor capable of recalibrating its economic structure in response to external shocks. Second, the United States had unintentionally exposed its own economy to vulnerabilities it had long assumed applied only to others. The threats were meant to solidify American power. Instead, they highlighted the limits of that power in an interconnected world where capital moves faster than policy and where stability, not size, commands loyalty. As the pressure campaign played out, a quiet but profound reversal took shape, one that few policymakers in Washington had fully anticipated. For decades, the United States assumed that its sheer economic weight ensured compliance from its partners. It believed that leverage flowed in only one direction, that threats would land with force on smaller economies, while leaving the American system untouched. But in a world of complex supply chains, mobile capital, and interconnected markets, that assumption no longer holds. The moment Washington hinted that the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement could be torn up or reshaped through pressure, the entire calculus changed for both sides of the border. Canada, far from retreating, began building an economic architecture that no longer relied on American stability as its central pillar. It strengthened domestic production, expanded trade networks, and repositioned itself as a predictable anchor in a region suddenly marked by volatility. This strategic evolution did not weaken Canada. It fortified it. By creating alternatives, Canada reduced the impact of any future American disruptions. And as the country diversified its partnerships, it discovered new leverage, not through confrontation, but through resilience. Meanwhile, the United States confronted the unintended consequences of its own strategy. The instability it introduced into the system circulated back through American supply chains, corporate planning, and consumer markets. When major industries paused investment, when manufacturers hesitated to expand, when households tightened their budgets, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The threats aimed outward were ricocheting inward. The story was no longer about disciplining a partner. It had become a case study in how an interconnected economy punishes unpredictability, regardless of where that unpredictability originates. What makes this moment especially revealing is how global firms interpreted it. Companies across Europe, Asia, and increasingly the global South began treating Canada as not merely part of a North American bloc, but as a stable launching point for international operations. They found in Canada a combination of political steadiness, broad market access, and institutional predictability that the United States was increasingly unable or unwilling to guarantee. Investors do not need ideological clarity, they need regulatory continuity. And in this confrontation, Canada became the country that offered it. This shift does not mean the United States is in decline as a global power, but it does mean something more subtle and in some ways more consequential. It means the old assumptions about leverage no longer work. In a global economy defined by mobility, diversification, and rapid adaptation, power is not measured solely by size. It is measured by stability, trust, and the confidence that partners place in your commitments. When those commitments falter, even slightly, the effects ripple outward into decisions made in boardrooms, factories, ports, and supply hubs across the